On Christmas Day 2011, a coordinated bombing of churches resulted in 41 fatalities. January 2012, another 3 churches were attacked on the same day in Kaduna State. But 2015 was probably Boko Haram's year of most brazen infamy. The group, using female suicide bombers, many who were mere children, attacked 28 different religious events, mostly mosques and Islamic gatherings. It was obvious even then that Boko Haram had lost the capacity to sustain military attacks in the way that it had previously done. Perhaps to shore up its image, it declared its allegiance to ISIS. Governance. Although former President Goodluck Jonathan's government escalated its crackdown on Boko Haram from 2011 onwards and declared a state of emergency in the northeast, it neither seemed determined nor focused on routing Boko Haram. Several factors may explain the government's attitude. First, a politically convenient narrative of the ruling party was that Boko Haram was actually sponsored by a northern Muslim political elite determined to discredit the Jonathan government, led by a Christian and which had its main support base in the predominantly Christian South-South and Southeast of Nigeria. When the opposition parties finally came together to form the current ruling party, the APC, the then ruling party's publicity organ was quick to describe the party as the Janjaweed party and worked hard to paint it as the political wing of Boko Haram. Indeed, it was not until President Muhammad Buhari, then the presumptive leader of the opposition, was nearly killed in a deadly Boko Haram attack on his car in Kaduna that the false narrative began to lose credibility. Secondly, the ruling party, also somewhat cynically, seemed to have considered that since Boko Haram attacks were actually in the heartland of the opposition, it was not necessarily an unwelcome development, as it could only weaken the opposition. Third, extensive corruption in arms procurement, estimated at about close to 15 billion US, ensured that the military remained poorly equipped and demoralized. A number of well-publicized mutinies occurred, and troops involved were taken through widely unpopular court-martials. As the government deferred and equivocated, Boko Haram proceeded to realize the objective of occupying territory and establishing Islamist states in Nigeria and in the Lake Chad Basin. In Borno State alone, it occupied and hoisted its flag in 20 of the 27 local governments that constituted the state. In Adamawa State, Boko Haram took Mubi and some villages in Yobe State. It was probably not until the abduction of more than 200 secondary school girls from their dormitories in the sleepy town of Chibok that public outrage against the government's inept handling of the insurgency reached a crescendo, even on a global scale. The government of the day then incurred widespread anger when it denied that an abduction took place and suggested that the opposition had simply invented the story. As the heart-rending stories of the girls' parents emerged, the credibility and sincerity of the government became severely questionable. Boko Haram continued to occupy most of the territories it had seized until 2 weeks to the general election, when the then federal government, in a move widely perceived as designed to gain some time, within which it may be able to turn the tide of the elections in its favor, postponed the elections for 6 weeks, ostensibly to flush out Boko Haram from the northeast. Although it recorded some successes, Boko Haram's hold remained largely intact. Its suicide bombing campaign was stepped up, and the first quarter of 2015 alone, there were several cases of suicide bombings resulting in deaths and maimings. Clearly, one of the strongest reasons for President Buhari's victory in the March 2015 presidential election was the expectation that, going by his reputation as a no-nonsense soldier, he would defeat Boko Haram and restore peace to the northeast. He moved quickly to realize his objective, announcing a relocation of the command and control headquarters of the army to Maiduguri, right at the heart of the insurgency. He sacked all the military service chiefs, some of whom were indicted in the arms procurement scandal. It has three core streams: the counter-radicalization and de-radicalization programs and the strategic communication program. The de-radicalization program is essentially custody-based, catering for convicted terrorists, suspects awaiting trial, and aftercare for convicts upon release. The strategic communication platform is designed entirely to mobilize our history and culture and reaffirmatory narratives to address the identity intellectual deficit that may in some ways account for radicalization of young people. The notion that Boko Haram ideologues would one day see the light and renounce their ideology and follow the path of peace is unlikely. Rather, it's a view that a more realistic objective will be to diminish its attractiveness to potential recruits by presenting counter-narratives that delegitimize violence against other Muslim persuasions or people of other faiths in order to gain the ascendancy of one's own ideas. So also is the supporting and promoting the ideas and teachings of mainstream Islamic thought leaders, not as apologists for Western thought, but as forceful advocates of authentic Islamic teachings. There's no question at all that greater official attention must be paid to human rights observance. The use of excessive force or extrajudicial or unlawful force, fatal or non-fatal, has been the subject of considerable attention by the Buhari government. The correlation between law enforcement brutality and violence by its targets and others under its care is too stark to be ignored. Part of the reason for respect for law enforcement is that they are fair and even-handed. Crossing the line would almost always lead to a loss of confidence, with the kinds of tragic implications that we've so often seen. The argument is sometimes made that asymmetric warfare of the sort deployed by the terrorists must be met with lower standards of human rights observance, or at worst, much more nuanced rules of engagement. The problem, of course, is that any discretionary observance of human rights is a slippery slope that is probably best not undertaken. The commitment that the federal government has made is to be consistent, and is to be consistent, and to ensure that it maintains the same evenness on issues of human rights. It's important to point out that political leadership in Nigeria has always been distrusted, and that has been so for many years and for good reason. This has promoted the easy embrace of dissenters of all shades by the people, including extremist organizations. But Nigeria has a great opportunity to change the perception of leadership as being corrupt and unreliable, with President Buhari, who is widely acknowledged as being forthright and honest. His name, in the north especially, as May Gasikia, the truthful one, is one that is a rallying point for most who believe that this might well be an opportunity for some moral leadership in Nigeria. Transparency in government, social investments, provision of education and healthcare would of course improve the government's image as being responsive. I'd like to end this with two stories. The one courageous, the other joyful, but both hopeful. You may have heard of the story of the teenage girl Aisha Ali Kaka in Borno State. About 18 years old, she was recruited alongside other young women to wear a bomb around her waist and detonate it at an IDP camp in the town of Dikwa. The mission was set for February 9, 2016. She decided that not only would she not carry out the assignment, knowing that many, including her own father, could be killed, but that she would even try to convince the other two potential suicide bombers to abandon the mission, but they refused. So she decided that she would lay her own life on the line by going to the targeted camp early on the day before the planned bombing to sound an alarm before the bombers arrived. But by the time she got there, the terrible deed had been done. The second story, earlier this month, on the 13th of October 2016, my wife Dolapo and I received and welcomed back to freedom in Abuja 21 of the schoolgirls kidnapped by the Boko Haram insurgents from Chibok over 2 years ago. After the trauma and deprivations of captivity, on the day of their release, they looked frightened, malnourished, and unkempt. But such is the power of freedom that a few days after the release, the girls were seen dancing and rejoicing heartily at a Thanksgiving service where their parents reunited with them for the first time in over 2 years. What the stories of the Chibok girls and that of the converted suicide bomber point to is a certain defeat not only of Boko Haram insurgency, but also of every stream and idea that seeks to divide rather than to bring together. Something that is clear, and a very major failure of the Boko Haram insurgency, is the failure to divide Christians and Muslims and to give the impression that this was actually a war of Islam against Christianity. As it turns out, whenever a bomb went off either in the markets in Maiduguri or in Kano, it never asked whether those it killed were Muslims or Christians. While we had to put troops on the ground to liberate occupied territories and free captive people in the northeast, we would have to continue the battle for the minds of the radicalized many, so that we can have more aminas of Dikwa saying no to terrorist propositions of death, despair, and destruction. Thank you very much for your attention.